Moving on to away from athletics, we'll move on to the case of Jacqueline Chomba. Jacqueline Chomba and ZISD. It's a very interesting case. I would declare interest from the word go, because I'm a part of ZISD, and I think I understand some of these issues. I'm looking at the principle of this case. A brief background of this case is that this player has been at the club, and these do happen, in many football clubs and among players. There are numerous such cases. One such case, I think that happened a few years back, or just a year or two, or just last year, was involving Andrew Perry from FC Musa. When the player met an agent, it was a crisis. So I have dealt with these player issues for a long time, beyond understanding what is happening to the case of Jacqueline Chomba, in as much as I want to declare a particular interest, because I belong to ZISD. So if a player who has been on a club's books, Jacqueline, the brief facts are that she joined ZISD 7 years ago. Now, in January 2025, into the end of that season, she wanted to move on to other challenges. The club was willing to release her. But immediately after the season in 2025, the player disappeared and showed up at ZESCO United. When the player showed up at ZESCO United, obviously ZESCO did their due diligence and established that the player belonged to ZISD, and they reached out to ZISD. At that point, there was a loan deal. The loan deal was signed for 6 months. The player moved on to ZESCO United from June of 2025 to December that year. During that period, Jacqueline decided to report ZISD to the Football Association of Zambia. When she reported to the Football Association of Zambia, she claimed that she had not been paid her allowances or her salary for a certain period. And she was owed, and therefore she wanted to place the club in default. Of course, she was being aided by her agents, and that case went on to be adjudicated recently by the Player Status Committee, chaired by Mr. Nicholas Momba, the chairperson of Southern Province FAZ. Now, the interesting facts in this case are that the current contract for Jacqueline is a 3-year contract running from 2024 to 2027. 2025 to 20, it's a 3-year contract running up to about 2027. That is the contract the two parties signed. However, when the matter went to the Player Status Committee, a new contract emerged. First of all, ZISD disputed they don't owe the player. Since that was the dispute, that was a dispute that was to be adjudicated by the player status. Now, when the matter went to player status, there was a new contract that emerged. That new contract clearly shows that it has been altered. The number 7 to show ending 2027 has been amended with a pen to show that the contract ends in sometime in June 2025. Now, any naked eye can see that amendment. If I have a contract somewhere nearby, I can show what I'm talking about. So, when that matter went to the Player Status Committee, after it was amended, after the contract was amended, both parties argued their cases. Then the Player Status Committee demanded proof that Jacqueline had received a payment from ZISD. If you've run some of these clubs and you are in football, you understand that most of our players, particularly in women football, come from less privileged societies, even in men's football. That's why we say football is a poor man's sport. So most of them, they do not have accounts, bank accounts. So transactions are done via mobile. And you pay the players as you go. ZISD has got a good structure where players are paid. Some players in the league, in the women's league, do not even receive salaries. Some players just play, with the hope and the mission of becoming the next Kundananji, to have the story of Barbara Banda. You come from Bauleni, play for Busa, and then proceed to find yourself at Orlando Pride. Come from, Chiwempala in Chingola, move on to Indeni Roses and get to Spain. You find yourself at BFC in the United States, California. That is how most of these, players in our girls' league, are taken care of. It is self-driven motivation to achieve. And when they come to the national team, that becomes their lifeline. That becomes their lifeblood. That's why you find that they compete to come to the national team. So ZISD is owned by individuals. The league is not sponsored. It pays bonuses just like teams that are sponsored by state entities such as Green Buffaloes, Red Arrows, Zanaco, Zesco, and the others. Some of the teams that are owned by individuals, check around. There is a huge struggle. But these are people that are making individual sacrifices to contribute to the development of Zambian football. That does not mean that they should take advantage of these girls. They should still ensure that they compensate these girls to the best of their abilities. And any player who is not paid has a legitimate claim to go to FAZ, to go to the player union and demand that they are paid. After all, that is their money and that is what they work for. Now, when you look at the records, Jacqueline was paid, but let's assume she wasn't paid for 2 or 3 months. There's no way that ZISD can fail to pay those funds. But when the matter went to player status, the dispute was that this is a player on a contract running up to 2027. You have a contract that runs up to 2027 in your possession, in your records that you submit to the Player Status Committee. You then find at FAZ a contract the player and the agent have submitted that has been amended to end in 2025. The matter comes up as a dispute. You, as a Player Status Committee, rely on a forged contract, to make a decision and say the contract for the player ended in June 2025 and therefore she's a free agent. That's a very strange decision. What makes it strange in this case? First of all, you can ask yourself a basic question. How did the player whose contract ended in June 2025 move on to play on loan with Zesco United from ZISD? That's the most basic question when you see two different stories. You see one contract is ending in 2025 and another contract is ending in 2027. The most basic thing to do is to look at the circumstances. So how did Zesco accept a player from ZISD? Why did the player at the end of June 2025 or July 2025 moved to play for ZESCO as a free agent rather than moving from ZISD to go to ZESCO or not. You have the Player Status Committee with evidence of a fraudulent contract. In fact, two contracts. One has ending in August, the other one ends in July 2025, with one signature of a player without the signature of the club. The other has got two signatures, the signature of the player, the signature of the club. But you proceed to make a decision without considering the material facts. Now let's assume, or let's imagine that as a result of that potentially criminal offense, the club reports the player to the police and the player is arrested for fraud. What's the football family going to say? The football family would not be happy. The football family would we need to help these players. I have got issues with the manner in which the FAZ registry is being managed. There's so much corruption in that department. That is the same department that created a chaotic scene during the FAZ election. That FAZ employee called Nyambe Matindo, in fact, I even met him in Cabo, and I told him what they did, which the FAZ president described as a joke of the century, was unacceptable. I'm now wondering what these characters are still doing at Football House. How are they being allowed to manipulate system? How can you upload in a FAZ system a contract that has been fraudulently signed? A contract that is clearly amended to the exclusion of another party. And you guys in the Player Status Committee, you go and sit. The most grave issue in that case was the presence of two different contracts that were not signed by another party. You go and rely on details from a contract that is signed by one party and not both parties. But there's another contract that is signed by both parties. I think we must end the corruption. There's a gentleman, during the FAZ election, Keith Mwemba said it was a joke of a century. It means that the people who were handling that process in the FAZ registry, where most of the anomalies were coming from, were literally jokers. Nyambe Matindo, that lad is not supposed to be working at Football House as we speak today, because the chaos they created during the election was unacceptable. Here is one thing they did during the elections. When you go into the FAZ system, you can deactivate an official and make them passive. So if that official is passive, it means that that official is not currently a member of FAZ because they have not affiliated themselves. They haven't paid the affiliation fee. But we still have those people. They are conniving with agents and players to manipulate the FAZ system. And you have a chairperson who is the National Executive Committee who doesn't interrogate these issues. Then what are you doing on the FAZ committee? What is your business? Is this the reason why you were elected from Southern Province to come and be a pedestrian adjudicator? As an adjudicator, you must question, you must raise various questions. Yes, there's an appeal process. And for sure, ZISD will appeal. They have said, look, this player will have to go. Okay? Because they have their own issues with the player. But the principle is that the rot in the FAZ registry must come to an end. Charles Chakatazia himself, I did send him a press query, and I'll read it out. I'll read it out because I did send Charles Chakatazia a press query, the FAZ General Secretary. Before he was appointed FAZ General Secretary, Charles Chakatazia was sitting on the Player Status Committee as a member of the Player Status Committee. So when this matter came up, I know he had knowledge of this matter, and I sent a press query to him. I said, "Good morning, GS. Hope you are well. Kindly attend to my press query on the player status verdict in the case of Jacqueline Chomba and ZISD. ZISD presented evidence that the player admitted, indeed, the player even admitted to amending the contract. He changes a 7 to a 5. And it's clear on the contract that that has been changed. When she was confronted, she says, "No, I'm sorry." This evidence was presented to the Player Status Committee. ZISD presented evidence that the player admitted to committing a criminal offense by forging a contract. It alleged that Ms. Jacqueline and her agent submitted at least 2 contradictory versions of the ZISD contract. First one, which has been availed to me, had clearly altered the end of NDA in original contract, dates of 13th August 2024 to 13th August 2027. This was amended to end 13th August 2025, which the player admitted to forging. The second contract is showing dates changed to end in July 2025 and does not have any ZISD signature. How did the Player Status Committee arrive at the conclusion that the player's contract ended in July 2025 when there is evidence of fraudulent activity and admittance of guilt by the player? Ms. Chomba allegedly had a 2-year contract running from 20 July 2023 to 20 July 2025. However, the committee acknowledges that Ms. Chomba played for Zesco Girls on a loan transfer from ZISD for the period 1 July 2025 to December 2025. So, if the committee acknowledges that the player was on loan at Zesco, how does the same committee declare the player a free agent at that point? Very contradictory decision. I think the player status must pay particular attention to these cases. And when there is a case of fraud, it is a grave matter. We know and we understand that in football, we're not allowed, or there are rules not to go to court on football matters. But with criminal matters, that is beyond football. You can easily take somebody to court who has criminally, infringed on football. So Jacqueline can easily be taken to the police. But you see, this is a girl who needs our help. This is a girl who needs everyone's help. The best is to find a win-win situation for both the girl and the club. I think there is no way we should tolerate or we should allow a situation where players are let scot-free when they're doing wrong, because these are the problems. When they go to the national team, it becomes more scandals and more scandals. We've had players in the past who have signed 2 contracts. We've had players who have ended their careers in similar fashion. And as fans, we must be above board to help these players, particularly when there is evidence to show there was wrongdoing. It is my hope that there will be a serious cleanup in the FAZ registry. Nyambe Matindo does not deserve to be in that position. For the mischief they did during the elections, you don't need that boy well, you don't need that man. I'm sorry to refer to him as a boy, but you don't need that man in FAZ. You don't need that man in the FAZ registry. The manipulation to the system was unacceptable. And we cannot continue with that. Gregory Sinyangwe himself does not, you see, he has overstayed in that position. Let's make changes to the registry department of FAZ. It's scandalous, very corrupt. And everyone who runs football in Zambia knows what I'm talking about. It is unacceptable. I mean, these guys, last time, they even created a crisis for ZISD. On one weekend, or is it on a Friday, they removed a player from the system. ZISD went to play. When they played without checking the system, that player featured as an ineligible player. Their opponents in that match picked that information. How? No one knows. But obviously, we can speculate. I mean, they lost 3 points. No. There's a lot of debt in that registry department. We need to deal with it unless the first president, who according to the constitution is a supervisor of the Secretariat, is a joker himself. Because if he's a joker himself, then yes, he can keep those jokers who he accused of causing a joke of the century in the last election. I think we must work on that registry. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. We cannot continue. We will not go anywhere. We can only speculate that if the first president wants to keep those guys, then he wants to use them in the next election to manipulate the electoral process, like they contributed to manipulating the electoral process in the last election. I mean, there's a case of one official, two dates of birth, two registration in the system. We had them. I think I must even have published that. Okay. That in itself, the official should have been disqualified. How he found himself on the ballot, no one knows. He went on and lost the election. But if you ask me today whether those two registrations are still in the system, no, they're not. They have deleted it. So they have the access to manipulate the system. And this must come to an end. You can do an audit query on the system, you can contact FIFA, and FIFA can assist. But this must come to an end. I am aware that ZISD is not the only club that has got complaints about the registry department. There are so many clubs and colleagues that are complaining about those guys. That system must be cleaned up. The first Secretariat needs a proper cleaning. And I hope Charles Chakata, as new General Secretary, has taken note of these concerns. We cannot continue like this. Zambian football will not go anywhere. We will be going